The rain in Busan didn't just fall, it screamed. Kang Han-soo, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the docks, stood over a rival with a coldness that matched the steel of his blade. But then, a tug. Not from a killer, but from a small, shivering hand. A 7-year-old girl, eyes wide with a terror that surpassed his own reputation, looked up. "Please," she sobbed, "save my grandma." In that moment, the dragon of Busan had a choice: maintain the monster or find the man underneath. Kang Han-soo lived in a world of silence and sharp edges. As the head of the Chengryong Blue Dragon Syndicate, his life was a series of calculated moves on a bloody chessboard. He was 38, with a scar running through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a night he nearly died in the alleys of Nampodong. On this particular Tuesday, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and fish scales. Han-soo was finishing a negotiation behind a derelict warehouse. His suit, charcoal gray and worth more than most people made in a year, remained impeccably clean despite the chaos around him. His men stood like statues, umbrellas held high, shielding their boss from the torrential downpour. "You don't understand," the man on the ground pleaded, his voice cracking. "The shipment was seized. It wasn't my fault." Han-soo didn't look down. He lit a cigarette, the flame of his lighter the only warmth in the freezing night. "In my world, fault is a luxury. Results are the currency." He turned to walk away, giving a subtle nod to his second-in-command, Min-ho. But then the sound of the rain was pierced by something human. A wail. Not a man's plea, but a child's desperation. From behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, a small figure emerged. She was drenched, her yellow raincoat mudded, her boots 2 sizes too big. She didn't see the guns, she didn't see the blood. She only saw the man who looked like he held the world in his hands. She ran. Before Min-ho could intercept her, she had crashed into Han-soo's legs, her tiny fingers gripping the expensive fabric of his trousers. "Please," she screamed, her voice raw. "The men in the black suits, they're taking our house. Grandma won't wake up. She told me to find a brave man. Please save my grandma." The syndicate members froze. No one touched the boss. No one dared. Han-soo looked down. For the first time in a decade, his heart gave a dull, painful thud. Min-ho moved to pull the girl away, his hand reaching for her shoulder. "Boss, I'll take care of this. It's just a street kid." "Don't," Han-soo said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a mountain. He looked at the girl. Her name was Jaiwoo, though he didn't know it yet. Her face was a map of malnutrition and grief. "Where is she?" he asked. "The hill," she pointed toward the Gamshan culture village. Not the colorful part the tourists saw, but the slum side where the electricity was a suggestion and the roofs were held down by stones. Han-soo did something his men had never seen. He knelt. He didn't care about the mud ruining his suit. "Show me," he said. The procession that followed was surreal. A fleet of black luxury sedans crawled through the narrow, winding alleys of the hillside slum, following a sobbing 7-year-old and a man feared by the national police. They reached a shack that looked like it was held together by hope and prayer. Inside, the smell was unmistakable, the scent of old age, poverty, and the looming presence of death. An elderly woman lay on a thin mat, her breathing shallow and rattled. On the floor nearby were crumpled eviction notices from a rival loan shark group, the Black Dogs. They were low-level thugs, the kind Han-soo usually stepped on like ants. "She hasn't eaten in 3 days, Jaiwoo whispered, clutching Han-soo's hand again. "She gave all the rice to me." Han-soo looked at the eviction notice. It was signed by Park Sang-di, a man who specialized in predatory loans to the elderly. Han-soo felt a cold rage bubbling up. It wasn't justice. He wasn't a good man, but it was an insult. Someone was hunting in his city using methods that lacked even a shred of honor. "Min-ho," Han-soo barked. "Call Dr. Kim. Tell him if he isn't here in 10 minutes, I'll burn his clinic down. And find Park Sang-di. Tell him he owes me a visit." The rain continued to hammer against the corrugated tin roof of the small shack, a rhythmic, metallic drumming that filled the silence as Dr. Kim, the syndicate's personal, off-the-books surgeon, knelt over the elderly woman. Outside, a line of black sedans blocked the narrow alleyway, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of predators. The neighbors peered through cracked doors, whispering about the men in black who had descended upon their forgotten corner of Busan. Hansu stood in the corner of the room, his shadow looming large against the peeling wallpaper. He looked out of place. His handmade Italian shoes were caked in the mud of the slums, and his silk tie felt like a noose. Jaiwoo sat on a low wooden stool, her eyes fixed on the doctor's every move, her small hands balled into white-knuckled fists. Dr. Kim sighed, pulling his stethoscope away. He looked at Hansu, then at the child, and beckoned the boss toward the door. "It's not just hunger, Hansu," the doctor whispered, his voice low so the girl wouldn't hear. "Her heart is failing. Congestive heart failure, exacerbated by severe malnutrition, and if I'm being honest, the stress of whatever those thugs were doing to her. She needs a valve replacement and intensive care. Tonight." Hansu glanced at Jaiwoo. She was watching them, her lip trembling. "Do it," he said. "Hansu, look at this place." Dr. Kim gestured to the damp walls and the single light bulb flickering overhead. "This isn't a clinic. She needs a private wing at the university hospital. That kind of paper trail, it attracts eyes. The police, the board of directors. You're supposed to be laying low after the Nam Podong incident." "I don't care about the eyes," Hansu replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I care about the girl. She asked me to save her. In my world, when someone asks for a debt of life and you accept, you see it through. Move her, now." Min-ho, who had been standing guard at the door, stepped forward. "Boss, we have a meeting with the elders at midnight. If you skip it to transport a civilian to the hospital, they'll think you've lost your mind. Or worse, they'll think you've gone soft." Hansu turned his gaze toward his loyal lieutenant. "Soft? Min-ho, do you know what's hard? Seeing a 7-year-old face a debt collector and not flinch. That's harder than anything the elders have done in 20 years. Call the hospital. Tell them the Blue Dragon is coming, and they'd better have a bed ready." As the paramedics, men on the syndicate's payroll, rushed in with a stretcher, Jaiwoo scrambled to her feet. She grabbed Hansu's hand again. Her skin was ice cold. "Is she going to die?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Hansu looked down at the girl. He didn't know how to talk to children. He knew how to break bones and negotiate territories, but he didn't know how to comfort a soul. He slowly reached out and awkwardly patted her head. "Not tonight," he said. "The dragon doesn't allow it." While the grandmother was being whisked away in a high-speed convoy toward the city's best medical facility, Hansu didn't go to the hospital. He had another appointment. The Black Dogs were a scavenging crew. They didn't run the ports or the high-stakes gambling dens. They bled the poor. Their headquarters was a neon-lit pool hall in the Seamyeon district, a place that smelled of stale beer and cheap ambition. Park Sang-di, the leader of the Black Dogs, was leaning over a pool table when the front door didn't just open. It was kicked off its hinges. Sang-di dropped his cue. "What the hell, do you know who?" He stopped mid-sentence. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Walking through the debris was Kang Hansu, followed by 6 men who looked like they were carved out of granite. "Sang-di," Hansu said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He pulled out a chair and sat down, crossing his legs. "I saw your name on a piece of paper today, a very ugly piece of paper." Sang-di swallowed hard. He was a bully, and bullies are the first to recognize a true predator. "Boss Kang, I didn't know. Which paper? We have many clients." "An eviction notice," Hansu said, lighting a cigarette. "For a shack on the hill, an old woman and a child. You've been charging them 40% interest a week. That's not business, Sang-di. That's bottom feeding." "They owed the money," Sang-di stammered, trying to regain some semblance of authority in front of his own men. "The law of the street." "The law of the street is whatever I say it is," Hansu interrupted. He leaned forward, the glow of his cigarette illuminating the scar on his brow. "You terrified a child. You made her cry. And because of that, I had to get mud on my suit." Hansu gestured to Min-ho. In a blur of motion, the Blue Dragon soldiers moved. The pool hall erupted into a symphony of crashing glass and muffled shouts. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution of power. Within 3 minutes, Sang-di's men were on the floor, and Sang-di himself was pinned against the pool table, his face pressed against the green felt. Hansu stood up and walked over to him. He pulled out a thick envelope of cash and tossed it onto the table. This is the principal of the woman's debt, not a one more. He then leaned down, whispering into Sangdi's ear. If I ever see your men within 3 miles of that hill again, I won't come for your money. I'll come for your hands. Do you understand? Sangdi nodded frantically, his face pale. As Hansu walked out of the wreckage, his phone vibrated. It was Dr. Kim. She's in surgery, the doctor said. But the girl, she won't leave the waiting room. She says she's waiting for the brave man. She won't eat. She won't sit down. She just stands there looking at the door. Hansu looked at his hands. They were stained with the dust of the pool hall and the faint copper scent of violence. He looked at his watch. The meeting with the elders was in 30 minutes. If he didn't show, it was a declaration of war against his own kind. Tell her I'm coming, Hansu said, signaling his driver. Boss, Minho asked, holding the car door open. The elders, they're waiting at the Golden Lotus. Let them wait, Hansu said, stepping into the car. I have a promise to keep to a 7-year-old. The hospital's private wing was a stark contrast to the grime of the slums. Here, the air was sterilized, the floors polished to a mirror shine, and the silence was heavy with the hum of expensive machinery. Hansu walked down the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing. He looked out of place, a dark omen in a sanctuary of healing. He found Jaiwoo exactly where Dr. Kim said she'd be. She was sitting on a plastic chair that was far too large for her, her legs dangling, her small yellow raincoat still clutched in her lap like a security blanket. When she saw him, her tired eyes ignited. She didn't just stand. She lunged toward him, burying her face in his coat. You came, she whispered, her voice muffled by the wool. I said I would, Hansu replied. He felt a strange, uncomfortable warmth in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a boy himself. He signaled to one of his men, who appeared with a tray of food from a nearby high-end cafe. Eat! You can't help your grandmother if you faint. Jaiwoo looked at the steaming porridge and the fresh fruit. She looked at Hansu, then back at the food. Will you eat with me? Grandma says it's bad luck to eat alone when you're worried. Hansu glanced at Minho, who was checking his watch frantically. Every minute they stayed here was a minute the elders, the council of 5 retired bosses who still pulled the strings of the Busan underworld, grew more insulted. Just a few bites, Hansu said, sitting awkwardly on the small chair next to her. As Jaiwoo ate, she began to talk. She told him about her father, who had disappeared years ago, and her mother, who had succumbed to illness when Jaiwoo was a toddler. She told him how her grandmother would sew buttons for pennies just to buy her a single piece of candy on Fridays. She calls me her little star, Jaiwoo said, wiping a bit of porridge from her lip. But stars are supposed to be high up. I felt like I was under the mud today, until you showed up. Are you a king? Hansu paused, a piece of fruit halfway to his mouth. No, Jaiwoo, I'm just a man who knows how to handle the mud. My grandma says kings protect people, she insisted, her gaze unwavering. So you must be a king. The moment was shattered by the vibrating of Hansu's phone. It wasn't a call, it was a photo. A picture of the Golden Lotus restaurant empty. The elders had left. Boss, Minho whispered, leaning in. They didn't just leave. They left a red envelope on the table. It's an official censure. If you don't answer for this by morning, the Siako faction will have the green light to move on our docks. Hansu stood up. The king was being called to his throne, but the throne was made of bayonets. He looked at Jaiwoo, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and doting trust. Stay here, Hansu told her. I have to handle some business. My men will be at the door. No one gets into this room but the doctors. Do you understand? Jaiwoo nodded solemnly. I'll wait for you, King Hansu. The Golden Lotus was a traditional tea house that served as the neutral ground for the Busan syndicates. By the time Hansu arrived, the tea was cold, and the only person remaining was Elder Choi, the oldest and most calculating of the council. He was a man who had survived 4 decades of gang wars by knowing exactly when to strike and when to wait. You're late, Hansu, Choi said. not looking up from his calligraphy. 2 hours. In our world, 2 hours is the difference between a deal and a funeral. I had a personal matter, Hansu said, standing in the center of the room. He didn't apologize. A dragon never apologized. A girl. Choi spat the word like it was poison. Word travels fast, Hansu. The dragon of Busan, the man who broke the Northern Alliance, is now playing nursemaid to a beggar. Brat. The other elders, they see this as a weakness, a crack in the armor. It's not a crack, Hansu countered. It's a debt. I'm settling it. You are settling a debt with a child, while your enemies are settling a debt with your life, Choi said, finally looking up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but sharp with malice. The Siako faction has already petitioned the council to take over the Hyundai pier. They claim you are distracted. If you want to keep your territory, you must prove you are still the man who earned that scar. And how do I do that? Eliminate the distraction, Choi said coldly. The woman, the child, they are anchors, Hansu. They will pull you down into the depths of the sea. Cut the rope tonight, or the council will cut you out of the organization. The silence that followed was suffocating. Hansu felt the familiar itch in his knuckles, the urge to strike. But for the first time in his life, he didn't see an enemy in front of him. He saw a mirror. Choi was what he would become if he continued down this path, a hollow shell of a man who valued order over blood and territory over a soul. The girl stays, Hansu said, his voice echoing in the wooden chamber. Choi sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. Then you have chosen war, not just with Siako, but with all of us. You have until sunrise to vacate your office. After that, any man who brings me your head wins your seat. Hansu turned his back on the elder. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Minho was waiting, his hand already on his holster. What's the word, boss? Hansu looked toward the hospital, then toward the dark silhouette of the city he had spent his life conquering. The word is war, Minho. Tell the boys to arm up. We aren't just protecting the docks tonight. We're protecting a little star. Minho hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Understood. Where to first? The hospital, Hansu said. They'll go for the girl first to make me bleed. We're going to turn that hospital into a fortress. The hospital was an island of white light in a city that had turned pitch black. Outside, the Blue Dragon soldiers moved with practiced efficiency. They didn't wear their usual suits. They wore tactical gear, blending into the shadows of the parking garage and the stairwells. Hansu had turned the intensive care unit into a fortress. Inside room 402, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic hiss-click of a ventilator. Hansu stood by the window, watching the street. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw stubbled. A soft groan came from the bed. Jai-woo, who had been curled up in a ball on the sofa, bolted upright. Grandma. The elderly woman, Mrs. Park, fluttered her eyes open. Her skin was still the color of parchment, but the gray tint of impending death had receded. She looked confused, her gaze drifting from the high-tech monitors to the strange, scarred man standing by the window. Jai-woo, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. I'm here, Grandma. The brave man saved us. He brought us to the castle. Mrs. Park looked at Hansu. She didn't see a king or a dragon. She saw a man whose soul was covered in soot, but whose hands were steady. She reached out a trembling hand toward him. Hansu hesitated, then stepped closer. He took the woman's frail hand in his own scarred palm. Who are you? She wheezed. Someone who owes a debt, Hansu said quietly. I have nothing to give you, she coughed, a pained smile touching her lips. Except, in my bag, the yellow jar. Jai-woo scrambled to the corner and produced a small, stained glass jar filled with homemade pickled radishes. It was a peasant's food, vinegar, sugar, and labor. To a man who owned penthouses and fleets of ships, it was worthless. Take it, Mrs. Park whispered. It's all I have left of my home, thank you, for keeping my little star bright. Hansu took the jar. It felt heavier than a brick of gold. He realized then that these people weren't just a distraction or a project. They were the first people in 20 years who looked at him and didn't see a weapon. They saw a human being. but the moment was shattered. Minho burst into the room, his face pale. "Boss, we have a problem. The Siako faction didn't go for the hospital." Hansu's eyes narrowed. "Then where?" "They went for the school records," Minho said. "They found out about the other girl, your sister's daughter, the one you've been hiding in the countryside." Hansu's blood turned to ice. He had a niece, Yoonjae, whom he had kept hidden for years to keep her untainted by his life. By helping Jaiwoo so publicly, he had led his enemies straight to his only real blood relative. The trap was perfect. While Hansu had focused all his firepower on the hospital to protect Jaiwoo, the Black Dogs and the Siako faction had sent a hit squad 3 hours north to the quiet village of Qingdao. Hansu's phone rang. It was a video call. The screen flickered to life, showing a terrified 10-year-old girl tied to a chair in a dark basement. Standing behind her was Park Sang-di, the lone shark Hansu had humiliated in the pool hall. He was holding a jagged blade near the girl's throat. "You like saving kids, don't you, Boss Kang?" Sang-di sneered into the camera. "Well, let's see which one you value more, the beggar brat in the hospital or your own blood." "If you touch her," Hansu said, his voice a low, guttural growl that made even Minho flinch, "I will peel the skin from your bones while you are still breathing." "Big words for a man who's about to lose everything," Sang-di laughed. "The elders want you gone. Bring yourself to the Nampodong docks by midnight. Alone, no guns, no Minho, just you and your conscience. If I see a single blue dragon suit, the girl dies." The line went dead. Hansu looked at Jaiwoo, who was clutching her grandmother's hand. She didn't know what was happening, but she saw the look on Hansu's face, the look of a man who was preparing to walk into his own funeral. "Minho," Hansu said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Stay here. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you kill them. No questions, no mercy." "Boss, you can't go alone," Minho pleaded. "It's a slaughterhouse. They'll have 50 men waiting." Hansu didn't answer. He went to his gym bag in the corner of the room and pulled out a long, cloth-wrapped object. He unwrapped it to reveal a mubium, a traditional Korean short sword, its blade blackened to prevent reflection. He walked over to Jaiwoo and knelt. "I have to go away for a little while." "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes filling with tears. Hansu reached into his pocket and pulled out his lighter, the gold one with the dragon engraving. He placed it in her small palm. "Hold on to this for me. If the flame is still inside, I'll be back to get it." He didn't wait for a goodbye. He turned and walked out of the hospital, his coat billowing behind him like wings. He wasn't the brave man anymore. He was the dragon, and he was going to burn Nampodong to the ground. The Nampodong docks were a graveyard of rusted cranes and skeletal shipping containers. The air tasted of salt and old blood. Park Sang-di stood in the center of a floodlit circle, surrounded by 40 men armed with pipes, machetes, and silenced pistols. In the center, tied to a wooden chair, was Hansu's niece, Yoonjae. Her eyes were red from crying, but when she saw the silhouette of her uncle appearing through the mist, she went silent. Hansu walked into the light. He was alone. His coat was gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the intricate blue dragon tattoos that spiraled down his forearms. "You're late, Boss Kang," Sang-di sneered, stepping behind Yoonjae and placing a blade against her collarbone. "I thought you cared about family." "I do," Hansu said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the crashing waves like a razor. "That's why I'm going to make sure none of you leave this pier." "You're one man. Look around you," Sang-di laughed, signaling his men to close the circle. "The elders have stripped your title, you're a ghost, and tonight we bury you." Hansu didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the mubium strapped to his lower back. With a flick of his wrist, the blackened steel caught the floodlight. The first 3 men rushed him with lead pipes. Hansu didn't dodge, he flowed. He moved with a lethal grace that hadn't been seen in Busan for decades. The short sword was an extension of his arm, a blur of dark motion. Within seconds, the 3 men were on the ground, clutching their hamstrings and forearms. Hansu wasn't killing them, yet. He was dismantling them. "Kill him," Sang-di screamed, his bravado crumbling into panic. The pier exploded into a symphony of violence. Hansu was a whirlwind of precision. He used the shipping containers as shields, the shadows as allies. He fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. He took a shallow cut to his shoulder, a pipe to his ribs, but he didn't slow down. Each strike he delivered was for Jaiwoo's tears, for her grandmother's struggle, and for the innocence of the girl tied to the chair. He reached the center of the circle. Sangdi, trembling, tried to pull the trigger of his handgun, but Hansu was faster. The short sword pinned Sangdi's hand to the wooden chair, inches from Yoonjai's face. Sangdi howled in agony. Hansu leaned in, his face splattered with rain and blood. "I told you I'd come for your hands," he whispered. With a roar of effort, Hansu untied Yoonjai, shielded her eyes, and whispered, "Run to the black car at the gate. Don't look back." As she vanished into the darkness, the remaining black dog thugs hesitated. They saw their leader pinned like an insect, and they saw a man who looked like he had stepped out of the deepest pits of hell. They dropped their weapons and fled into the night. The victory was hollow. As Hansu stood over the broken Sangdi, his phone chimed. It was a message from Minho at the hospital. "The Elders' assassins are here. We're pinned in the ICU. They're using gas. We can't hold them much longer." Hansu realized the docs had been a feint. The Elders didn't just want his niece. They wanted to erase the distraction that had made Hansu defy them. They wanted Jaiwoo and the grandmother dead to prove a point. Hansu didn't have time to wait for his car. He hijacked a high-performance motorcycle from a fallen thug and tore through the streets of Busan, red lights a blur, the engine screaming at 12,000 RPM. His ribs were cracked, and blood was soaking through his white shirt, but he felt no pain. He reached the hospital as a black van was peeling away. "Minho!" Hansu roared, stumbling into the lobby. He found his lieutenant slumped against the elevator, a bullet wound in his thigh. They took her, boss. They took Jaiwoo. The grandmother is safe. She's in the secure ward. But they took the girl. They're heading for the Hyundai Cliffs. They're going to throw her over." The Hyundai Cliffs, the edge of the world. A place where the current was so strong that nothing ever came back. Hansu didn't say a word. He turned back to the motorcycle. He arrived at the cliffs just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in a bloody orange. Two of the Elders' top enforcers were holding a sobbing Jaiwoo over the railing. "Stop!" Hansu yelled, his voice cracking. He was barely standing, leaning against the bike for support. The enforcers turned. "The Elders said if you appeared, we were to offer a trade, Hansu. A life for a life. You jump and the girl walks. You refuse and she goes first." Jaiwoo looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. "King Hansu, no." Hansu looked at the girl. He thought of the pickled radishes. He thought of the little star. He thought of the 20 years he had spent taking lives, and the one chance he had to finally save one that mattered. He stepped toward the railing, discarding his weapon. "Let her go first," he said. "Let her walk to the other side of the bridge." The enforcers whispered to each other and pushed Jaiwoo toward him. As she ran past, Hansu caught her arm for a brief second. He pressed his gold lighter into her hand one last time. "Keep it bright, little star," he whispered. He turned to the enforcers and smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that looked terrifying on his scarred face. "My life for hers, that's the deal." Without a second of hesitation, Hansu stepped over the railing and plummeted into the churning, icy depths of the Busan Sea. The sea off the Hyundai Cliffs was a chaotic tomb of salt and stone. When Hansu hit the water, the impact was like slamming into a wall of concrete. The cold was an immediate, paralyzing weight, pulling him down into the kelp-choked darkness. But Hansu was a man who had spent his life fighting the current. As his lungs burned for air, he saw a flickering light through the surface, the sunrise. It reminded him of Jaiwoo's eyes. With a final, agonizing surge of will, he clawed his way toward the rocks. He didn't die that morning, but the dragon of Busan did. While the underworld celebrated the supposed death of their most fearsome kingpin, a silent purge was beginning. Minho, acting on Hansu's prearranged dead man's orders, began dismantling the Blue Dragon Syndicate from the inside. He didn't use bullets this time. He used ledgers. Years of secret recordings, bank statements, and evidence of the elders' corruption were delivered to the National Police Agency. One by one, the men who had ordered the hit on a child were dragged from their villas in handcuffs. The Black Dogs were disbanded, their assets seized and funneled into a secret trust fund, the Little Star Foundation. For 6 months, the city whispered about the disappearance of Kang Han-soo. Some said he was a ghost haunting the docks, others said he had fled to the mountains. But in a small, quiet suburb of Jeonju, far from the neon lights of Busan, a man with a heavy limp and a deep scar over his eye was seen helping an old woman move her flower pots. Han-soo had cleaned the slate by erasing himself. He lived in the shadows, not of crime, but of a quiet, mundane life. He worked as a carpenter, his scarred hands now shaping wood instead of breaking bones. He watched from the periphery, a silent guardian who had traded a throne for a soul. 15 years later, Busan had changed. The old slums of the Gamshan Hill were now a thriving community center, supported by an anonymous donor. At the University of Busan, a young woman stood in her graduation gown, her eyes bright with a familiar, stubborn fire. Jaiwoo had grown into a brilliant young woman, a doctor specializing in cardiac care, a path chosen because of the man who had once saved her grandmother's heart. As the ceremony ended, Jaiwoo walked toward the back of the auditorium. She ignored the cameras and the cheering students. She was looking for a specific seat in the very last row. It was empty, but on the chair sat a single, small jar of homemade pickled radishes and a worn, gold lighter with a dragon engraving. She picked up the lighter and flicked it. The flame stood tall and steady, refusing to go out even as the afternoon breeze swept through the hall. "I kept it bright," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. In the distance, standing under the shade of a large maple tree on the campus grounds, a man in a simple gray suit watched her. He looked older, his hair peppered with silver, but his posture was that of a king who had finally found peace. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. He saw her smile, saw the way she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had been loved and protected. He had given her a future, and in return, she had given him a reason to survive the fall. Han-soo turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of families and graduates. He wasn't a boss, a criminal, or a myth anymore. He was just a man who had answered a child's plea. And as the sun set over the city he once ruled, Kang Han-soo realized that saving one life was a far greater legacy than ruling 1,000. The little star was no longer under the mud. She was in the sky, exactly where she belonged.